Hello and welcome to another Smaulgld live stream. Today is Monday, October 15th, 2018. And tonight we're going to talk about the new petrodollar backed by U.S. oil, natural gas, and soon to be coal. Before we do that, let's take a look at some of the things that happened during the day, as well as the gold and silver prices. So let's first take a look at what happened in the gold market. I'm going to show you the trademark charts that we have been showing you every night to keep you informed in a graphical way. So let's take a look at the gold price. We had a good day for gold. Gold opened at 1217, climbed up to 1233, and has closed at 1226. It's up almost $10. Not a bad day for gold. Silver, almost as good. Gold led silver higher, which is what you like to see if you want to see rising, sustainable prices. You want to see gold going higher, consistently higher, silver trailing, but not too far behind. And then you want to see gold continue to make that increase, and then finally silver makes that spike if it all works out. Just so happens it hasn't worked out since 2011, but we're almost there in 2016, I think. Now let's take a look at silver. Opened at 1458, got as high as 1475, and closed at 1468, up about 0.72%. Now what did that do for the gold-silver ratio? Well, because gold went up more than silver, gold-silver ratio continues to climb, and the gold-silver ratio is now closing at 83.62. Okay, now let's take a look at the cryptocurrencies. Cryptos had a very good day. Bitcoin up 4.3% at 64.37. Bitcoin Cash up 4% at 4.47. Ethereum up 7% at 203.81. Litecoin up 4.25% at 53.52, and Ethereum Classic at 9.55. Now, what's driving those prices higher? Well, there's always something, but I think finally the markets are catching on to what I've been saying for about a couple of years now, that Wall Street is moving in, and we see the anticipated launch date of Bakkt, the Microsoft, New York Stock Exchange, Starbucks consortium is going to launch sometime in November, and that will be a trading platform with physical delivery of Bitcoin to start. We've seen that AD Ameritrade has announced plans just the other day to launch a crypto trading platform called RSX, and Fidelity Investments, one that I predicted well over a year and a half ago, announced its plans to enter into the crypto space later this year with a trading platform. Just think about what that means. That means that people that are normally used to buying and selling stocks will be able to do so and buy cryptos the same way that they buy and sell stocks. They're not going to have to go to some weird exchange and figure it all out. It'll all be done in the same method in which they buy and store. In a way, when you buy stocks through Fidelity, you're storing your stocks with them. You don't take delivery with them. So they're going to have that option as well, storage. But I know that the Bakkt system is also, the Microsoft New York Stock Exchange will also have physically delivered. Okay, tonight's topic, though, it's nothing to do with cryptocurrencies. It is about the dollar. I'm going to go quickly back to, I have had a different point of view starting as far back as 2014 on all this dollar collapse, game over, game changer, end of dollar hegemony, all of that stuff I used to believe in, and I believed in it for a reason. Not because I was hoodwinked into the narrative, but because it made sense. Why? Well, starting in 2009, especially when the Fed initiated QE, that was a wake-up call for a lot of people, including the Chinese and others who owned U.S. treasuries. The idea at that point was, wait, hold on a minute. you're just going to print dollars and you're going to buy your own treasuries, the ones that we paid money for. The Fed is going to print dollars, and then you're going to buy treasuries, and we paid for ours, so you're in effect diluting the value of our treasuries. And that seemed to be, not seemed to be, appeared to be, or was criminal in a sense, in that monetizing debt meant that they could just buy U.S. treasuries and fund the deficits without even having to worry that someone would buy the bonds. The Fed would just buy them themselves. And then the Fed also printed money and bought mortgage-backed securities from the too-big-to-fail banks. To add insult to injury, they did it 3 times. So clearly, the U.S. had an issue leading into the financial crisis in that the U.S. had been running big deficits. And then, to top it off, they have a financial crisis and they decide they're going to print their way out of the issue. And of course, that made people realize that the US dollar's days might be numbered. And also, that's what drove the gold and silver trade, because you said, wait a minute, if they can do this, well, gold and silver you can't print into oblivion. So that's what gave excuse me, gold and silver its bid. But then I realized to myself, the one thing I noticed with QE, they were very, very clever. I don't have the chart here today, but I did a YouTube on this where I saw as the dollar declined in value as a result of the announcement of QE1 and the progression of it, people getting nervous, they would stop QE. And then the dollar would start to recover and go up, and they think, okay, well, that was a mistake, but they're done doing that. And when the dollar rose enough after 3, 6, 8 months, they'd announce another one, and the dollar would start to go back down again. And when the dollar got really low, they'd stop again, and then they'd wait for the dollar to rise after they stopped, and then they'd start QE again. And by the time they did QE3 was the largest. What they did in QE3, which was very clever, during the entire QE3, even though it was large, they kept talking about tapering it. They kept talking about cutting back on it. And that prevented the dollar from really collapsing. And then, for a couple of years after they ended it, they kept talking about wanting to raise rates, gonna raise rates. All right, so I saw what they did, and I realized a lot of people say, oh, they're going to crush the dollar to save the markets. Never. The dollar is the most important thing that the United States have. Second most important thing might be the stock market. But you don't crash the dollar to save the market. You try to save both. And as you can see, the dollar index has done very well. It's much higher than it was when they started QE, and so is the stock market. So they did manage to pull off that trick. But then I thought, they're not stupid. And a lot of people say they're criminal. That's fine, but criminals have to be smart not to get caught or to pull it off. I started noticing in 2014, well, what's going to happen here? Is supposedly the dollar is backed by the Saudi Arabian oil and the petrodollar. Briefly, petrodollar means that when the U.S. went off the gold standard, the Europeans were thinking, well, why should we trade in dollars if it's not backed by gold? The U.S. worked with Kissinger, Nixon and Kissinger worked out the petrodollar arrangements with Saudi Arabia, whereby Saudi Arabia agreed with the United States to price oil only in dollars and accept only dollars for their oil, provided the U.S. provided its protection. Fine. That was a good deal. And that allowed European countries to say, okay, well, we have to buy oil, so we might as well accumulate dollars or hold on to our dollars. We can't turn them in for gold anymore, but we can hold on to dollars because we're going to need to buy oil. Everyone needs to buy oil. And Saudi Arabia was, at the time, far and away the largest oil producer. Just like South Africa, both countries have the same initials, SA. South Africa was of great geopolitical importance when it had the world's largest gold reserves, was producing the most gold, and the world was on a gold standard and needed to be fed gold. Well, South Africa is not as important anymore because its gold reserves have been depleted, and the world doesn't run on gold, or the monetary system doesn't run on gold anymore, so South Africa is not as important. Well, I see the same thing, and I saw the same thing starting to happen to Saudi Arabia back in 2014. Why? Well, first of all, Saudi Arabia was very important during 2013, 2014, 1973, 1974, because that alliance with the U.S. enabled the U.S. to retain the dollar as the main currency, reserve currency of the world, because Saudi Arabia was the big oil producer at the time. The other big oil producer was Russia. Russia was also a gold producer, but they were part of the Soviet Union, so they were not in the free market. So Saudi Arabia had a very significant geopolitical importance. They had large gold reserve, large oil reserves, and they were now taking only dollars and only pricing their oil in dollars. Okay. Back in 2014, I've been following the shale oil boom, and one of the things that I noticed, this is the very beginning of it really, was that the United States had always been talking about not relying on foreign oil exports, and I saw the shale oil as a way, potentially, that the U.S. could become oil dependent. But I thought beyond that. I said to myself, but wait a minute, if they start producing large amounts of oil and actually outproduce the Saudis, then maybe they can start exporting oil, which they weren't doing at the time because they didn't have enough. The U.S. did not have enough oil. Then I said to myself, if the underpinning of the petrodollar was that countries had to have dollars to buy oil from Saudi Arabia, wouldn't that same logic apply that they'd have to have dollars to buy oil from the United States? Now, I'd already gotten to the point where I realized that the dollar wasn't just supported by countries needing dollars to buy oil, because oil as international trade is only 8, 10, 12% of international trade, and that the dollar since 1973, because it had been used as a currency internationally, had developed a life of its own and a market of its own, and because of its use, it's almost, the more you use it, the more it gets used, and there's a network effect that countries held dollars in reserve, and the dollar was the world reserve currency, not solely because it had to buy oil with them. They had dollars far in excess. Countries had dollars far in excess of the amount of money they needed to buy oil, but they had dollars as a reserve currency. So I didn't even think that the petrodollar was as important today as it was back in 1974, 1975, and in the early decade, or the decade when they first instituted those agreements. But I did think that if the United States was an oil producer, well, that would be another reason to have dollars. You'd have to have dollars to buy from Saudi Arabia oil, and you'd have to have dollars to buy oil from the United States. And of course, the U.S. would price it in dollars. So back in 2014, you're looking at this screen, I had written a blog post called "The Black Swan Emerges Covered in Cheap Oil." And I wrote this in 2014. This is, I covered it again in another article. Back in December 2014, a black swan emerges covered in cheap oil. We remarked on the developing U.S. shale oil production. If shale oil takes off, I wrote, the U.S. solves 3 issues. 1, becomes energy independent. That's the obvious thing that everybody was looking at. 2, creates jobs. Remember, we were worried about jobs. We were in the midst of a post-financial crisis recession. And 3, no longer needs Saudi or Arabian oil to create demand for the dollar, because the export of shale creates its own demand for dollars and replaces much of the Saudi Arabian demand. Now, we've seen that, and I'm going to show you what's happened since then. Not only do we have the demand for the dollar just in general because of 45 years of use, but also because Saudi Arabia still prices its oil in dollars, still accepts only dollars, and now the United States also, you need dollars to buy oil from the United States. So during that time period, I was thinking, well, wait a minute. That's not going to be enough to support the dollar. What we're going to need to support the dollar back then is we've just gone through 3 QEs. Well, what's going to have to happen? Well, the Fed, it's not just enough that the Fed stopped QE, but that the Fed is going to have to raise interest rates, because you've got all these countries talking about de-dollarization, the BRICS have had it, and so on. End of dollar hegemony, game over, game changer for the dollar, dollar collapse. And I thought, well, wait a minute. The United States isn't stupid. I saw how they manage, or the Fed isn't stupid. I saw they managed their QEs and managed to actually come out on the other end after doing 3 QEs and printing $4.5 trillion and not destroy the dollar. Unbelievable. Well, one of the things they did was they convinced the European Union, Stanley Fischer convinced Mario Draghi, his protege, to do QE. Well, that just makes the dollar look better if Europe is doing QE, and they've been doing it even longer than the U.S. has done QE. They've done $5 trillion in QE. They buy corporate bonds. So they effectively convinced Europe to debase their currency more than the Fed had debased the U.S. dollar. They also saw, when they finished QE3, Japan launched theirs. They went to negative interest rates. Bank of England launched a QE. People's Bank of China needed no invitation to do QE. They've created the most credit, like 70-75% of the world's credit in the last 7 or 8 years. So now the United States, according in the Fed's view, is no longer doing QE, and the rest of the world is printing like mad. So in comparison, the Fed looks prudent, if you can imagine that. But people that are on this dollar collapse, end of dollar hegemony, the U.S. is running up deficits, yeah, that is all true, still is true, was true, is true. But they fail to realize that the rest of the world has surpassed the United States in credit creation and reckless monetary policy. So I thought, how can the Fed in the United States continue to keep the dollar strong without it falling off a cliff? Well, I just mentioned they convinced the rest of the world to do credit creation. Then I said, well, they're going to have to raise rates. And that's at a time when you heard all your major commentaries. Fed can never raise rates, never raise rates. If they do raise them, it'll be one and done. And then they're going to go negative, on and on and on with that kind of stuff. Every major commentator was saying that. Then when they raised them once, twice, they didn't raise them as much as they said they would. I'm still right. Fed can't raise rates. They're going to collapse the economy. And I kept saying, no, this is 2015. Does the Fed need to raise rates, interest rates, to combat de-dollarization initiatives? And my logic at the time was, let's take a look. What did I write in 2015? Was that the Fed had to raise rates because they could not be, they would have to create demand for the dollar, because who wants to have a currency or a bond that doesn't pay any interest? And so I thought the Fed would raise interest rates. So in June of 2015, I stated boldly, the Fed will raise interest rates. This is at a time when every commentator was insisting they wouldn't, that actually the next move they were going to make was to lower interest rates in the negative territory, and then it was going to be game over for the dollar, and gold was set to skyrocket and to soar. Well, what I wrote was, the Fed will raise interest rates. The Fed will raise interest rates on the pretext, false narrative, that the economy is doing well. Now remember, in 2015, the economy wasn't doing well, so by their logic, they shouldn't raise rates. And I said, well, they're going to raise them anyway. If data continues to come in negative, the Fed will insist it's transitory. That was a big word Yellen used to use. And the economy will improve in the second half. Higher interest rates, I wrote, are necessary to promote U.S. Treasury bond sales and a strong dollar. Higher interest, and they were saying, well, they can't raise rates because they can't afford the interest payments, which is a ridiculous argument because they can't afford the $21 trillion in deficits. They clearly can't afford that. What's another few hundred billion to pay interest? They'll just print that up too. Higher interest payments can be covered by selling increased nominal amounts of treasury bonds. Remember, when you issue bonds, you get all the money, and now you have all that money, you can pay the interest on it. That's what I thought in 2015 in June. Started thinking this way back in the beginning of 2015 when everybody was saying it couldn't happen. Well, when it did happen, everyone was surprised, but they thought, well, they didn't really raise them. They're not going to raise them any further. There's going to be a collapse if they do. And so I wrote in 2015 when it happened, and Silver Doctors actually published it, which was nice, why the Fed raised interest rates. And in that year-end article, I wrote that the Fed raised interest rates. Why did I say that? Here we go. As predicted, the Fed Reserve, predicted by me, announced a quarter rate hike today. All year we have said the Federal Reserve would raise rates by the end of the year to stay ahead of other central banks. This is before they even announced the European QE, to boost demand for U.S. Treasury bonds, which according to yesterday's Treasury report is clearly in decline. The Fed's policy is focused primarily on protecting the United States' most valuable asset, the dollar, and its ability to get the world to buy treasuries so it can continue to fund its massive welfare warfare state. Fed policy is not about protecting too big to fail banks, the economy, the stock market, or the job market. Those are secondary objectives. The Fed's primary objective is to protect the U.S. Treasury and its ability to sell U.S. Treasury bonds. De-dollarization is a nascent but real threat to dollar hegemony. But the Fed knows without strong demand for treasuries, the Fed is done. A rate hike makes U.S. Treasury bonds attractive compared to other bonds, especially at a time when the Bank of Japan, the ECB, the Bank of England, Bank of Switzerland have lower, in some case, negative interest rates. So that's the end of 2015. Many commentators had egg on their face. They said the Fed wouldn't do, but then they were insisting it would never happen again, and it was one and done. And so the mantra continued into 2016 that the Fed would not raise rates. And what happened in 2016? They didn't raise rates all year. But I said in May of 2016, if the Fed has to, they will raise interest rates once again. And I again predicted that they would raise rates, and they did. At the end of 2016, the Fed raised interest rates once again. That's when some commentators were saying, well, they've only raised them twice. They didn't really raise them. They stopped using that because now they've raised them 7 times. So they can't say, well, they only raised them 7 times, and I'm more right than somebody else who said they were only going to raise. Anyway, lots of people justifying their bad calls and insisting that they were still correct, even though they were clearly incorrect and thought that the Fed could never raise rates. Now, I continue to believe that that's what they would do, and they have done exactly what they said they would do. They would eventually ratchet up the interest rates, and they have done that. But let's go back to our petrodollar story, because not only did I see it happening at the end of 2014, I followed up on that story in, I guess it was 2017, in July, when I said, is the US dollar becoming the new petrodollar? And that was on the basis that now the United States was a major oil producer. They had become one since 2014, and now I was seeing exactly what I had foreseen might happen. They really had ratcheted up the shale oil production, and I said with OPEC oil cuts and U.S. oil production and exports surging, is the U.S. dollar set to replace the Saudi-backed petrodollar? Actually, so far, it hasn't replaced the Saudi-backed petrodollar. It's complemented the Saudi-backed petrodollar because we still have the Saudi Arabians buying, selling its oil only for dollars and pricing it only in dollars. So back in 2017, I had mentioned that, and then in August of 2017, I noticed something else. Not only do we not have to worry as much about foreigners not buying our treasuries, but that some of our major tech companies, our friends at Apple, Google, Facebook, they also buy tremendous and increase their treasuries by an enormous amount. So you can imagine how the government, I don't know if directly or indirectly, places pressure on them, but they held 100 billion plus as of June 30th, 2017. Last I checked, they've increased that even more. But back to oil, I want to show you what I started tracking, and I haven't even followed up on this chart, but let's look at the oil exports, not just the production. You can see through 2017 a doubling from 2016, and when I started looking at it in 2014, it's basically a tripling. So now you can see the U.S. is a major player in crude oil and a major exporter now as well, because they then started exporting oil. Natural gas also became a big export. We've seen now Trump going to Germany and saying, what are you doing? Why are you buying stuff from Russia? You can buy it from us. Okay, and then earlier this year, I had also just reminded everyone that I was on this new petrodollar backed by U.S. oil kick. because we saw more evidence that U.S. oil production and exports were surging. So you see what's happened is the United States dollar has benefited from fiscal policy, which is no longer doing QE, which is raising interest rates far beyond the other major central banks. We're at nearly 2.25% right now on the Fed funds rate, when all the other banks are at 0.25%, 0%, or negative. The Fed is not doing QE. Yes, the U.S. still has a deficit, but so do all the other countries. Japan's debt to GDP is like 250, 280%. And also, they are going on another major credit binge. And that's why the yuan is not doing very well. But if you look at what's happened with the dollar because of the Fed is not only raising rates while others are negative or flat. It's not doing QE while the others are doing QE and buying bonds, Swiss National Bank buying stocks, Bank of Japan monetizing all the Japanese bonds. But the Fed is actually selling off some of its assets. So this makes the Fed and U.S. monetary policy very hawkish and seem very prudent. Now, it doesn't excuse the fact that they printed $4.5 trillion. But in comparison to the other central banks, it is very prudent, and it's getting Donald Trump very pissed off because they're raising interest rates. And now, today I learned this. So now we have countries needing to buy oil and natural gas from the United States and needing dollars to do that, and they already hold dollars because the dollar is the world reserve currency, and they do hold dollars as their major reserve asset. Euro is second. Then it goes down to yen, British pounds, Australian dollars, Canadian dollars, Swiss francs, and then Chinese yuan, which is like 1% of overall reserves, very small. But now we're seeing this very, very interesting development. I've been saying the new petrodollar backed by U.S. oil, natural gas, and now add coal. This kind of flew in under the radar. The U.S. is a major, or is now starting to become again a major coal producer. And the Trump administration is thinking, hey, we can export some of this coal. Now, the entire Paris Accord and green crowd is saying, no way, Jose, we got to stop using coal. Coal is bad, okay? And the Trump administration is saying no. So, the western states, California, Oregon, Washington, very much environmentally friendly, very much saying, no, 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 you're not going to use our ports to export that carbon-producing footprint of coal. It's not going to happen here. Well, the United States eyes military bases, West Coast military bases, in order to export the coal and gas from there. And the rationale there is that they use the military bases. They can say, look, it's in our national interest, our national defense interest, that our allies who need coal can get it. And we can't have these states blocking us under environmental reasons. Come hell or high water, we might be able to use these bases to ship out the coal. And guess what those countries are going to need to buy the coal? U.S. dollars. So that's my view of it, and that's how I've looked at it the past few years. I don't just listen to and parrot the entire alternative financial media, end of dollar hegemony, game over, BRICS have had it, game changer, dollar collapse, all that stuff that everyone parrots. I try to look at everything and understand, why hasn't the dollar collapsed? Well, I've just given you some good reasons. Why hasn't gold soared to 50,000 or 10,000 as somebody wrote a book about? Why has the Fed been able to raise rates 7 or 8 times when they were never going to be able to do that? People have, or they don't adjust their thinking, or they just ignore other facts, or they cherry pick facts. But worst thing is that at least give credit to people for creating some of these narratives, but then lose credit for not ever amending their narratives when facts change. But the worst is when you get the echo chamber, everybody just repeating it. I'm not saying I'm right, but at least you can see, well, I kind of am right of what's happened so far, and I've rationalized it through what I've been looking at, and I just wanted to give you how I look at things, and this is how I form my points of view. I don't just listen to game over, game changer. Russia is buying gold. That is all you need to know. I don't think that way. I never have. So, any event, I know a lot of people like to tune in and hear the same thing. They like to hear the same narratives, and then they get mad when they hear me say something that doesn't fit the narrative. I mean, I hear something once or twice. That's enough for me. I don't have to hear it on 18 channels. All right, well, let's see what you guys have been thinking while I've been ranting and raving, or depending on your point of view, imparting some information. Let's see what you guys think in the comments. All right. And around the world says not me. Weak knee, tree huggers, collapse, coal. Yeah, not me. Still like the intro. Shark Air, what's the average price for silver the last 50 years? I bet it's close to the current price. No, actually it's not. It's pretty close to the average price of 10 years ago, but it had been down much more. It was in the single digits. Shark Air, did the Saudis kill the journalist? They're saying yes. They're saying now, I think they're going to admit that they brought him in for interrogation, and maybe they kind of roughed him up a little bit, and then maybe they roughed him up a little bit too much, and then oops, maybe we killed him by mistake. I think that's the latest that I've seen just running across the wire and on Twitter and so on. I'm trying to buy silver, but the spot price is insane. What does that mean? Ben Didrix, no black swan so far. Some perverted guy needs money for Texas. Okay. Bendrick, dollar isn't collapsing. I am collapsing. All right. Here it is, Steve Hall. Dollar is toast. I mean, Steve, I'm sure you've seen a lot of YouTube videos. All the famous people, they've been telling you, end of dollar hegemony, dollar collapse, game over. It. United States is spending money like drunken sailors. They're not looking at the full picture. All they're doing is preaching their narrative. They won't get off that narrative. They predicted the end of the dollar. I've seen it. YouTube videos. End of the dollar in 2013. Dollar dies in 2015. End of dollar hegemony. You just see this stuff over and over and over and over and over. It never stops. And of course, one day there won't be a dollar. And of course, one day there won't be United States. And one day there won't be you either. But these guys have been saying the same stuff for over a decade and predicting it to be imminent. And they get people to listen to them and then get mad and insist it's bound to happen. It's a mathematical certainty. How long has Deutsche Bank been collapsing? That's been predicted all. Deutsche Bank, derivatives. They have no idea what they're talking about. They don't even know what derivatives are. They sound like a big word. They give it a big number and then they say, see, it's going to collapse. COMEX is going to default. COMEX is going to default. COMEX is going to collapse. Dollar is going to collapse. Everything is going to be a game over, game changer. And nothing's going to work. And the only thing that's going to work is the gold that's buried in your backyard. It's a very, I think, very unclever, but very, very effective narrative that a lot of people buy into. Dollar is toast. Only a matter of time. Years, not decades. Fools that believe otherwise will suffer. Yes, game over, game changer. I'm sure. All right. What else do we got? Dollar's very durable and resistant. The propaganda push is non-stop, strong with this one. It's not propaganda, Steve. It's propaganda to repeat narratives and insist they're going to come true, and they haven't come true. They haven't come true during the timeline that people have suggested they were. Dollar collapsed 2013, 14, 15, 16, 17. Yes, eventually the dollar will collapse. You'll collapse. Everything collapses. But it's not propaganda to explain why it hasn't happened and why the dollar has new legs. You got to look at the rest of the world, not to what people have been repeating for 7 or 8 years. That was a good, yeah, when the pump, all these dollars will come home. They create inflation. Yep. 2015 is the year I found Smaulgld. Glad I found this channel, said Miser. Well, the dollar is supposed to end in 2015, said one famous ranter on YouTube who repeats the same stuff over and over again. People, once they believe that story, they insist that anyone who disagrees with it is an idiot. Not realizing that they're holding on to a position that's false, and then they try to make it seem like the rest of the world doesn't understand, even though the reality of what's happening shows they don't understand. No, dollar isn't only backed by unprovoked violence of the military. We're no longer clearly superior militarily. Again, there are people out there that pitch this to people, insist that China is like the world's greatest place because they have gold, and that the dollar is evil and the Fed is evil, but somehow China, with its social credit score, communist totalitarian society, multi-issuances of credit, building of ghost cities, somehow that's okay. It's the dollar is the worst thing. And that is a cottage industry. Dollar collapse. Game over, game changer, end of dollar hegemony. What if China backed gold, backed yuan? Remember that one? Gold backed yuan. Last thing China would ever do is back the yuan. Oh no, Sun Tzu, China is smart. They read Sun Tzu and they have gold. Complete nonsense. Dollars will flood back and cause hyperinflation. It's all underway, yes. Yes, game over. Yes, stand for delivery. China's going to stand for delivery on the COMEX. JP Morgan has 900 million ounces of gold, of silver. All these stories are complete rubbish. Rubbish, 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 as they say in England. But people believe this. Yes, indiscriminate printing is monetary suicide. Study my history. Listen to more YouTube nonsense. First of all, as I mentioned, if you were listening, what country isn't indiscriminately printing? China is the worst offender in that. In fact, the U.S., as I mentioned, the Fed is no longer printing. The Fed is the one country, the one central bank that isn't printing. Zero debt here. I'm ready. Okay. If you want a tanker or oil, they will deliver anything else. Steve says dollar savings beyond 6 months is pointless. Well, that makes sense. You only need dollars to the extent you need to spend them. And it doesn't make sense to save in dollars. You can save in other things, and hopefully they appreciate so that you'd have more dollars. Like you can appreciate other assets like stocks, bonds, gold, silver, real estate that should outperform the dollar. So it doesn't make sense to have all your cash in dollars. Who said debt doesn't matter? What kind of fool believes such crap? Did not say debt doesn't matter. See, it's very difficult once you've been indoctrinated into the dollar collapse, game over, game changer, gold back yuan, end of dollar hegemony. You hear things that are never said. What you hear is somebody attacking the narrative, so you assume they don't understand sound money or history. They don't understand that debt is bad, that you can't borrow your way out of debt. It doesn't matter until it does. All these cliches. Yes, does any logical adult believe, no, that's right, it's the other way. Small, I read the Saudi authority will apply sanctions if they point the finger at Saudis for the missing Saudi journalists. What sanctions can they apply to us? Well, one thing that they can't do, that they were able to get away with in the 70s, is an oil embargo. That's not going to harm the United States. The U.S. being a top exporter will do nothing for us peasants but raise gas prices. That's correct. I didn't say this was good. Remember, I'm analyzing this not from a moral perspective or not from the perspective of whether it helps you or me. I'm analyzing it from the perspective that is the dollar going to collapse? And my answer is no. The reason, anything you can say about the dollar applies to all fiat currencies. And if you look at all fiat currencies, the fiat currencies most likely to collapse in order are probably China and then the EU and Japan. They have far worse geopolitical and debt situations and economic situations. It's not the dollar. It's those three. All right. Saudis can dump T-bills, buy weapons elsewhere, jack oil prices. Now, that's another thing I tracked. Saudi Arabia's never had that many treasuries. They still don't have that many. They threatened if the 9/11 bill passed that they would dump their treasuries, which would mean no. So they dumped $30 or $40 billion in treasuries. Market's so liquid that they used to do that in 1 month in QE. That's not a big deal. But actually, after the 9/11 bill passed, and I did a blog post on this, Saudi Arabia in 2017 increased its treasury holdings and still has a tremendous amount of them by 50%. The reason they hold treasuries is it's their way of preserving their wealth, and it's the most liquid asset. You see, a lot of people don't understand. They just, oh, dollar is toilet paper. Who would want to hold treasuries? The treasury market is the deepest and widest market on the planet. They're not called risk-free for nothing, treasuries. Yeah, they're backed by debt and all that other stuff, but the world takes treasuries by the trillions. That is a fact. So the armchair guy banging on his computer complaining about the dollar and how it's toilet paper doesn't understand that the rest of the world, the rest of the central banks don't think that. Dumping treasuries was another one. Russia dumped all its treasuries. Nothing happened. Russia dumped. They went from 60 billion to 118 billion down to 10 billion, and nothing happened at all. They dumped all their treasuries pretty much. But they still have dollars. They just don't have treasuries. So they're missing out on the interest. Oh, let's see. Is it safe to say if gold rallies big, the gold to silver has to be less than 60? No. What happens, my view is that gold goes first. Gold rises for a long period of time. Silver trails it. And then when gold really has solidified a bull market, then silver takes a spike. And unfortunately then takes a dive. And not more nonsense. Gold-silver ratio will revert to the historic average of 10 to 16. There's no reason, no rationale other than silver pumpers telling you that. The gold-silver ratio hasn't been anywhere near 10 or 16 to 1 for 115 years. Nowhere near. It was there in 1980 for about 10 seconds. Went to 16 to 1. In 2011, it went to 31 to 1. Even when the gold price was fixed at $35 from 1934 to 1974, the gold-silver ratio never got down to 16 to 1. Just because relative rarity is about that means nothing. Platinum is 10 times rarer than gold, and gold is more expensive. I'm not going to get into it tonight, but again, that is a silver pumper argument. They insist and they keep telling you it's going to revert to the natural ratio. They've been saying it for 7 years, and the gold-silver ratio has gone nothing but gone up from 60 to 1, 70 to 1, 80 to 1, but it's so indoctrinating to these people's heads that it's going to go to 10 to 1 or 6 to 1 or worse, 1 to 1. It's ridiculous. Many think U.S. being top exporter is going to be great for consumers. Now we'll get jacked with high prices. That's true. I don't disagree there. Walden Tree, that's the point. Fed may be evil, but it's not weak. Correct. China, Japan, Korea can even fuel themselves. Correct. China does not have oil. China's got 400 million people that moved into major cities just in the last 10 years. They've got to keep that engine running, and the only way they keep it running is they need energy and they need to issue more debt. Their own People's Bank of China governor said, we have probably already reached a Minsky moment. We have probably already borrowed too much money, and we are not getting the return on it. And they were going to try to deleverage, and then they got hit with tariffs. When people talk about China, as if China is some unstoppable nation that the U.S. is finished, they don't understand what's going on. And the reason they think that is they've heard it on 20 different YouTube channels. All this silver pumping, 16 to 1 gold silver ratio, COMEX default, gold back yuan, dollar collapse. Every precious metal channel pumps the same nonsense. Dollar supply is drying up. That's right. If you owe dollars, you're in trouble. Absolutely. Especially if you have one of the lousy currencies like the Turkish lira, and you can't buy more dollars with your lira because your lira is worthless. All right. Let's see. Why did China's huge developers cut real estate prices by 30%? Their way bursting the bubble. Well, now the people in China are furious, and they're going to start to riot because they see the real estate prices falling back. Right? The Treasury could buy back all the treasuries without a blink of an eye. All right. Well, I want to thank people for listening tonight. This week, later in the week, I've got some more updates on COMEX Vault Silver, what's being held there. I've got new Indian gold and silver import numbers, so please make sure you check in. And make sure you get your Smaulgld mug, because Smaulgld mugs are game changers, and they are solid assets, and they cannot go to zero. And they are good in an emergency. They're good self-defense weapons. And let me just show you. There they are. The Smaulgld mugs. They are hard assets. So please check them out. And we will see you again tomorrow night, 8 o'clock. Also check out Smaulgld at smaulgld.com. BitChute minds.com, gab.ai, Facebook, and Twitter and Google+. Thank you very much.